Okay. So I guess most people here know the work. You are wondering if you could give a brief introduction to your work, like a 5-minute introduction. We have the book floating around.
Could you repeat again? If it sounds a little bit weird, like jumpy. Do you too, dear?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, now it's better.
Start off by giving a brief introduction to your work in whatever way you think is best. It could be a very casual way. I don't know if you want to just talk about it, want to show it on your website, or whatever's best for you. Just the 1 or 2 people here that don't have it.
Let me find a file to make this easier. Oh, completely unprepared for this.
It's okay, we're putting you on the spot. Let me make sure it's going to share enabled.
Carlet. I'm gonna do an experiment. Okay. I'm gonna do a super quick experiment.
We like the hair.
It's good for the winter. Keeps me warm.
Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot. It's not the most organized thing. I kind of threw this together.
It's okay. So we are Cruz Garcia, Natalie Frankowski, and we are many things, including designers and architects and artists and teachers and I don't know, like I don't know how to describe many of the things we're doing, curators, poets. So we met in 2008 in Belgium, and that was in the financial crisis of, I mean, many of you were really little back then, I'm assuming, but it's kind of similar to these years where there's a lot of uncertainty and so on. That's us in 2008, many years ago. I used to wear glasses, as you can see, and has and Natalie there also some years ago.
I think we saw going full screen because we only see the PowerPoint file.
Ah, really?
Really?
Yeah.
That's strange. I could see full screen.
Now?
Yeah,
You're good now. Yeah.
Okay.
You're the
Strange. So this Natalie and me in 2008, when we were thinking, man, we were working in a studio, I was thinking that this sucks. We had to do something else. It's not really like what we want to do. And then these are like the 12 years of our 13 years of our practice. So everywhere we've been, like teach, live. We met in Belgium, moved to the Netherlands, lived in China for 7 years. So then we went from this our apartment in Beijing. I know many of you seen this before, but I'm just sharing like this our apartment when we used to do events there. Like this is where we live. That's Blinky and Pasha. Blinky is the one, the little one. The big one that is in my arms is Pasha. Blinky was naughty, super naughty. So this is Guillet. That is the street where we used to live. So we went from this street to like waking up one day in Taliesin in Wisconsin, former home of Frank Lloyd Wright. So it was like how to deal with these landscapes of, in a way, settler colonialism, sort of industrial landscapes, and also with the legacy of the sort of the male white architecture genius that is going to save the world, right? And he's usually taking the credit from all the collective work. So that's Frank Lloyd Wright. And that's also, we're trying to like kind of change like how to teach in those spaces and how to think about architecture in those spaces. So we made our students made a series of projects a little bit similar to Interpunk, but we kind of forced them to initiate it through the class because we were really like making them not deal with Frank Lloyd Wright, and we almost lost our lives doing that because it was like a lot of fanaticism and like kind of intense environment. We used to work with high schoolers. These are the thesis of some of our students. terrible documentary with that name, frankly, right? The Man Who Built America, whatever that means. And then, I'm just gonna flip through all this because these are many of the things that are really important to our work, civil rights, many of the struggles, images that haven't changed if you think about it, right? Like this in 68 and now, 50 years later or more, we're still dealing with the same stuff. So Baltimore in a 50-year span, and it tells you how little things have changed. And also like who has been at the center of these struggles, who are the sort of, the forms of knowledge that we're really interested in engaging with, and the forms of struggle that relate to the things that we're thinking about. And we've been thinking about how to question, the construction of history in architecture. And these are two cool maps that show that, like on one side, Alfred Barr, talking about styles, in the way that we're taught in architecture school oftentimes, when people are saying like, oh, first came Cubism, then came Suprematism and Modernism, right? And then they never address like all these regimes of extraction and oppression that not only allow these things to happen, but even where they steal their style many times. But like, there's no European avant-garde without African spoliation, right? Without the looting of the Americas, without all the regimes of oppression around the world that made them the empires. And that's what Hank Willis Thomas is addressing in that map, and that for us has been really important. Like, how can we think about extraction, how it relates to us? And we show this map, this painting, because it's a painting about slaves being thrown overboard in order to the enslavers to claim the insurance, and that used to happen. And this is a painting by Turner. And what is interesting about this painting is not only the content about that horrible act, but the fact that the family that used to own this painting, when they sold it to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, with the money that they got, they bought a sugar plantation in Puerto Rico. So it's like all these things are not messed up only because of the content of the images, but also because of the finance and the economies that fueled them. So that has been really central to us. So we've been thinking about how understanding the colonies in a way, like Puerto Rico being the oldest colony in the world, how understanding the thousands of people that died during the hurricane and nobody counted for is so similar now to COVID, what's happening, right? Where many people have lost their lives and sometimes we don't even count them either, right? So there's like a blueprint of the sort of the colony that becomes a blueprint to understand the world right now under necropolitics. Also something that we've been thinking about, right? Like, who are at the center of these imaginaries and these forms of struggle and resistance around the world. And you have, as you see in this T-shirt that we love, it says anti-patriarchal, feminist, lesbian, trans, Caribbean, Latin American, right? So it's like true manifestos of struggle and true manifestos of emancipation. This is some pictures in Puerto Rico and Pittsburgh during the Black Lives Matter protests. In the Puerto Rico, so it was the protest against the governor that they kind of kicked out for corruption and homophobia and a bunch of awful stuff. And understanding, what's the role of architecture in all of this for us is really important. So I'm gonna just flip in through this. We've been talking about like systems of prisons, like what is our role as architects when we are able to say no? What is our contribution to the destruction of the environment? Where do we stand in those fights to protect the environment, right? And who has been kind of creating form of democratic acts of architecture where people come together to bring down monuments that were never democratically erected in the first place. So that has been also really important for many of the things we've been doing. And we've been like decoding all these images, right? Like of settler colonialism, of empire, of the construction of an imaginary of occupation, right? And here is a great picture because you can see architecture, basically New York in the background on the one side, and then on the other, on the indigenous people kind of getting pushed out. And this has been part of our project of reclaiming images, landscapes that are quite violent because they erase all the indigenous people that used to be occupy these landscapes. And we've been reinserting architectures in them in a series of projects where we kind of create post-colonial landscapes where we highlight ideology in the images, sorry. We have made a series of exhibitions. So now it's jumping. here, right? And then we've been questioning, legacy of education in architecture, like the Bauhaus, where they used to like kind of force women to go into interiors and textiles and not let them do architecture. And we've been focusing and studying other schools, like the People Art School in Vitebsk. And our own collective. And you've seen some of this. We actually made one collaboration with Interpunct where we kind of redesign one of the issues. We kind of turned it into post-novice propaganda. And also our lecture in Carnegie Mellon was an installation of post-novice with all the plants and the pedestals. Do you want to go ahead, dear, and explain this part?
So also like this brings something that is very, very important for us. And I think that changed a lot the way we practice too, is the fact that we work a lot in collaboration with different people. So post-novice, as you remember when we presented it, we also have like fiction writers who joined us. We have filmmakers who join us. We have also students or people who were students before. And also it's the idea to, because we feel also like to have like to address certain really pressing issues of architecture, it's helped us a lot to seek other fields and to seek also how other people speak about those issues too. And also in terms of, again, like questioning, because landscape, relationship to territories, relationship to land is very important to us. And understanding also that this collaboration helps us also to extend like having like different members from different places too. And so extend also our understanding of different places and not just being, people from the outside, but also trying to like bring like a better understanding of how we can speak of different places, right? So always having like people from the place that could also join the collective in order to kind of expand the discussion. Yeah, so that is, as you remember, the lecture installation we did at Carnegie Mellon, which was one of the last one we did for a while.
That's one physical. It was one of the the last physical installations, because
Right,
after this everything got closed. So it was like turning also that in that sort of a post-colonial landscape, right? And trying to present. We've been developing some of those projects into plays, like theater plays, and also like collaborations with fashion brands, like with United Nude, where we made this series that we shot in Pittsburgh, make like advertisement of United Nude in this sort of post-colonial narrative, where we were part of the images that we were presenting. And there's a video you can watch. But the idea is that in that case, we're not really hiding behind the images, but we're also inside of them. So it's all part of all that sort of staging, setting, narrative, sort of a critique of ideology, and using tools to represent some sort of narrative. Sorry.
I already know what you guys are. Little London.
In like black mask. They're gonna dance. It's like when we finish playing basketball, they go to play, like they do like a dance choreography or something. It's pretty cool. It's
sorry, like just to relate to what we think. That's one of the latest installation we did at Iowa State, where we had like two parts of exhibition. One was called like the Loud Reader Room, that was like a continuation of a program of loud readers that we did before. And the other part was the Planetary Redshift, which was like presented also like 4 different works of filmmakers in relationship to question again of land, territories, and futurities.
We've been doing like collaborations with writers and stuff, but this is, for example, a mural that was done by students in some of our students in in Virginia Tech, in University of Berkeley in California, and then the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So they made this really long mural that was part of the play, and this started also in Carnegie Mellon. So I think like many things that are like really important right now in our practice, they somehow happened in Carnegie Mellon when we were there. Like we started Loud Readers when we were teaching that seminar where several of you were there, Black Square to Black Reason. That was kind of like a blueprint to understand what was happening at the time, but before it happened, which was really weird. Then we started in March this program called Loud Readers that was based on the lectores of the tobacco factories that used to read for other workers that didn't have any means of education. So they would read for them during the entire workday. And the practice of loud readers was very legal, of course, because they were like loud reading poetry, like decolonial, anti-capitalist, communist, anarchist literature, including Luisa Capetillo, that was one of the syndico anarchists that got arrested for wearing pants in public. So in her case, like when the practice got banned, we thought like this is a really, really amazing kind of platform that can inform a way of sharing knowledge. And then we kind of used the Zoom service, and we made Steve to buy us some microphones and stuff like that. And then, I mean, actually we bought them and then we passed them the bill to the school saying like, hey, we're gonna buy these microphones to run on like a free online architecture school in March. And then we started running the program of loud readers. And now it's been like lots of sessions, over 70, I think, sessions, including a free online summer school and 2 curatorial projects, series of publications, right? So we like opened the platform, and there's always, these are all the speakers that we had until now. And also we have sessions with students, for example, Carnegie Mellon meeting with students from San Luis Obispo or other universities in Brazil or in Europe, try to like figure out what's happening and what are the important things, and how to address many of the critical questions of our time. So that platform of Loud Readers has been also really central to some of the projects we've been doing. I know some of you have seen these workshops of like how to build post-colonial landscapes, but we also made them online accessible so people can download the files, like the backgrounds, like here step by step. We made this video that is like a Bob Ross video where you can hear like, now you take a landscape like this and you find a sculpture and you chop the head, right? And you insert it in the landscape and you can build your own post-colonial landscape postcard, right? And share that sort of post-colonial imagination. We had like activists, poets, architects, historians, fiction writers join in this platform and loud read or present their works. And that has allowed us to create some sort of theory curriculum, where we are thinking of critical theory and critical thinking as a trade, in the same way that we will learn about masonry or woodwork or plumbing, where we can share it freely online. And then this has allowed us to sort of decenter Eurocentric forms of knowledge and reinsert other forms that are central to understand what's happening around us in the world. And that has also allowed us to create curatorial platforms. Like we have this, in the exhibition right now, we have this video show with a poet, Raquel Salas Rivera, and 3 filmmakers that are addressing ideas of race and gender, settler colonialism. We've been doing, I know some of you saw it maybe, or I had the chance also to be loud reading in the streets in Pittsburgh when many of the protests of young, Black, and educated were happening in the streets. So it was not just like, this was at the same time that we had published the anti-racist manifesto of architecture. So it was really interesting to be talking about like the sort of white supremacists and settler colonial legacy of our planning in the street to people. Then I know that there were students there because after they came and they talked to me. So it was really interesting also to have that chance, not only to be like talking within the ivory tower, right, in a bubble, but rather be there in the streets and addressing some of those questions, right? And also talking about Pittsburgh, I also had the chance to go in One Hood's This Week in White Supremacy show, or in like 2 times or something like that, and share, and discuss some of the ideas that we've been presenting. We were teaching professional practice in Virginia Tech, and we took the chance to kind of like use the platform to think about other forms of practice. So we run a lecture series called Ways of World Making. And within the lecture series of Ways of World Making, we had a second lecture series called Activism as Practice. And then we had Wan Hood and Yazidi, Brian Lee from Collocate and Design as Protest. And, you know, it's a Wolf just from South Africa. So it's kind of relocating funds to generate those projects. And then through Loud Readers also, we've been publishing a series of projects like the Anti-Racist Manifesto that I just mentioned, and this one that it got downloaded like 20,000 times in the first 2 weeks since we published it online. It's called A Manual of Anti-Racist Architectural Education. That was born pretty much out of Virginia Tech being really, many really terrible, conservative, racist, misogynist faculty, and it was unbearable to be in the faculty meetings. And every time that I would bring a point, people would gaslight the shit out of me, or like they would like make fun of other faculty members, disabled people. Like, it was really disgusting. And I figured out that maybe you had to speak to them through drawings because they were stupid, so they wouldn't understand concepts. So we had to make a book that was like step by step to how basically how to understand how the education they were providing was really incomplete and problematic. And then we made this really comprehensive manual. It's divided in 3 parts. That is a manual of anti-racist architecture education. And the funny thing is that there's no such a thing before of this, which makes you think that it's really problematic, our education, when nothing like this was published. And then we divided in 3 parts. One is before school, and it addresses, you know, the importance to think about why school is so inaccessible, right? Like, what's the history of architectural education, you know, being really racist and sexist discipline. And it's not like we're inventing this, you know, it's well documented. Many schools didn't even admitted women, you know, and even less, you know, like Black women or indigenous women, right? Like Latino women until some of them until the 80s, right? And then trying to rethink those diagrams of the Bauhaus, of Walter Gropius, and trying to recenter the things that we thought were important, like how can we have a diagram where we intersect all the forms of knowledge that we're getting in school through an anti-racist, anti-ableist, trans-feminist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and ecologically just lens. And it's a spiral, so all the other concepts that we can add, they can be added, right, without changing the sort of makeup of this. And then intersecting all the forms and history and theory and media, either Eurocentric and status quo, or the new forms that we're bringing. How can we always intersect them through this? So we are always aware that we're engaging with the really pressing questions that have been historically marginalized. And that's part, like having Loud Readers has really allowed us to sort of present those ideas. And also, like, for example, engage with the Charles Jenks maps that maybe you have seen in the theory class. They're really stupid and insipid because they only look at architecture like architecture is in a bubble. So we wanted to show like what happens when we reinsert politics in this, right? And then we show in this map, you know, in 140 years, how between Jim Crow, apartheid in South Africa, and white Australia policy, there has always been an anti-Black regime of law in place in the last 100 years of the last 120 years, which is really alarming if you think about it, right? Like in a really global scope. And you can see in all the points in this space how many institutions are related to this, right? Like how many institutions, like the Foundation of Architecture Schools, the Foundation of the Museum of Modern Art Architecture Collection, the foundation of the NAB, right? Like the accreditation boards, the foundation of the AIA, or, you know, publications of books, and how all these things have been always kind of intrinsically connected with a legacy of overlooking and displacing and erasing and, you know, and capture and predation, right? So it's like a map that allows us to center these questions. And this is what they, you know, usually the problem. I don't know if you've been following the shit show of Side Apollo. I don't know if anybody has seen that recently. The guy that was the dean of Princeton, and then he got fired. Has somebody followed?
A little bit.
Yeah.
It's really ridiculous, you know, but it shows you how sick architecture is, right? Like the people in power, it's just this.
Explain very briefly what happened.
Yeah, spill the tea for us.
So this guy that is here, that is talking with the Charles Jenks, you know, Side Apollo, that is this OMA, blah, blah, blah nonsense. He was the dean in Princeton. And then during the Biennale of Kulha some years ago, he wrote a chapter for a catalog or something like that. And then he was plagiarized. I mean, he basically took it from Wikipedia, which we will even reprimand students from doing that. But of course, he's the dean. He didn't even quote Wikipedia. And then, then he got demoted from the dean position in Princeton. And then it became this scandal, blah, blah. But then many years later, now finally they got rid of him. And then this guy made a 5-hour video denouncing the woke culture in the US and all this, and then attacking the dean and talking about like all the ridiculous, like sexist, Eurocentric, narcissistic points he can make up, like really sad and depressing and funny also. It's really funny because it's really narcissistic. The guy made a video of 5 hours where he's literally talking nonsense. And then he wrote this paper. Let me see if I find the paper where he is like, wait, because it's really funny. It was the name. It's incredibly funny. The title, something about the woke university or something like that. Side Apollo. But then, you know, like this guy is the same guy talking with Charles Jenks. You know, the people that make these maps are always the same people. They just, and then let me see, woke, Side Apollo. Okay, he released it. The title of the essay is incredible. Let me see if I find this somewhere here. He made that. It's all like a bunch of nonsense. It was on something like the fascisms of the woke university or something like that. And then he's accusing professors for defending, like he's accusing the president of the university for punishing a professor that called Black activists terrorists. And then he's defending the president. He's basically accusing the president for reprimanding the professor for calling the students terrorists. It's like really decadent, right? Like the whole spectacle, right? And then, yeah.
It's called The Fascism of Difference in the Post-Truth University. This text.
That's the title. It's really ridiculous, right? And when we see this map, we can see, you know, how Philip Johnson was literally in Germany attending a Hitler-Junts rally. The same year he founded the design and architecture department in MoMA. And there's no coincidence as to why the first work of a Black architect was collected in 2018, right? Like, you know, with the thing already like 60 years open, right? So it is, you know, there are white supremacist institutions. And we've been like even making graphics about how expensive are the education, you know, like places like Carnegie Mellon, where you don't find, for example, Black students from Pittsburgh, because it's unaffordable for a Black family to afford that if it's not just through scholarships or something like that. So these institutions, they extract wealth from a place, they gentrify those places. And also maybe some of you remember this, we use it as an example. Do you remember this? The map?
Yeah.
The same.
Yeah. Usually it's in color, but yeah.
It's in black and white, but the famous map that erased many of the Black parts of Pittsburgh, right? And we were saying like how this is not really a coincidence because that's how they treat the city in a way. And there's no, I mean, and also this is more specific to you being there, but it's not a coincidence that CMU develops computer science and the other department develop predictive policing software, and they're also gentrifying parts of Pittsburgh, right? Because it's part of the grand project of like bringing a form of intelligence and wealth to Pittsburgh, but not really taking care of the people of the city, right? So I think like in the case of CMU, it's really particularly problematic. So then we made these graphics in relationship of some of the most prestigious universities in relationship to the GDPs of many countries around the world, to show that like the average person could never dream, you know, of being in any of them. It's just like completely unaffordable. And then we've been working in a series of publications to recently, like this post-colonial narrative architecture poetry book. Some of the studios we taught there when we were in CMU that were about the loud readers. This is the last studio we taught. Christophe was in the studio, as well as many of your friends perhaps, and members of Datum. Some of the projects by Taylor, right, like dealing with black liberation and art. This was before Black Lives Matter, right, in the summer, but of course it was already kind of part of the class, or Christophe making this sort of a palace of protest to learn about protesting. And some of the other projects were engaging with you know, questions of surveillance, you know, AI identification of faces, land reparations. This Cassandra, and the project was supposed to be in Puerto Rico, right? So we're thinking about also a colonial site in a former military base. And this last studio we taught in Virginia Tech during COVID, where the students are kind of presenting in the museum images. And then now we were teaching in Colombia in the summer, and they invited us and they told us, you can teach here in Colombia something that you cannot teach anywhere else. And we said, like, what can we teach in Colombia that we cannot teach anywhere else? Because we teach pretty much everywhere, everything we want, everywhere we go. But maybe in Colombia, we can teach about how to measure the colonial footprint of Colombia. So we were there, and then we started going to the museums and that, like, kind of trying to measure the colonial footprint of the museum. So we went to the Met with our students, and then our students started researching, like, seriously, all many institutions in New York, like the Guggenheim, MoMA, the Met, and Columbia University. And at the end, they made these amazing works where they were basically exposing, you know, how the boards of directors were literally entangled in forms of oppression and military violence in the places where sometimes they collect works and they show exhibitions about those places, like Palestina, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, like how literally they are part of the carceral capitalist system, how they benefit from that, and they like try to like hide those things by contributing to the board of the museum. And also some of students, they also engaged with the legacy also in the Met, with the boards of directors in the Met, and with the thing, how they construct an idea of the world through their imperialist lens, about all the items they have stolen. We invited the students to make these formulas, mathematical formulas. None of us is mathematicians, so we have no idea if they're correct or not, but it doesn't matter. So you can see colonial footprint equals, you know, seized indigenous land plus systems of gender binaries, multiply patriarchal hierarchies, cultural appropriation, whitewashing, hegemonic masculinity, Western capitalism, right? So there's something that is trying to engage with a history of colonialism within the museum. And then this one is about Colombia. It got so hardcore at some point that the student he was a more mature student. He already had a master's. He had a practice of architecture in Chile for like 10 years. And then he did a master in aesthetics, it's like philosophy. And then he came back to school to Colombia to like try to question, you know, even his own understanding of architecture. And then he started doing this amazing research about Colombia. And at some point he was freaking out saying like, do you think I'm gonna get in trouble with the university? And I was thinking like, don't worry, you know, they know all of this. They know how terrible they are. They don't care, you know, because then he found out that Colombia was the biggest real estate developer of New York. And then he had all these connections to slavery in the past, but also to literal apartheid in Palestine right now, and literal gentrification of Harlem, right? So it's not just a practice of colonialism that stopped 100 years ago, but it's ongoing, right? Like it's in the future plans of the university. And that in this box in the middle here, alma mater is literally the same lady that is floating in that settler colonial painting of John Gast. So it's always the same characters, right? Of this sort of education is gonna transform us and bring us into modernity. So it's really interesting, the idea how can we use a studio in an institution to see the problem of the institution itself, right? And maybe that was the only way we could have been teaching at Columbia at that moment, because we were like, I'm not sure about this, but if you give us the chance, right, where we can come here and create a shit show about your own institution, we're good to do that. We're always happy to piss people off, burn all the bridges and do barbecue on them. So then, and then, you know, apart from all this relates to, you've seen so many of this, how we work with children and doing workshops and children's books and installations, right? Where we're always trying to engage with how to talk to different public and how to, you know, address important questions about how do we relate to each other, how do we understand the environment, how can we create or destroy together, and this has also been at the center of many of our publications, you know, and how they engage with form, how we try to learn with form. Some of the books we've done and exhibitions, and I'm literally just flipping through them. Chicago Biennale, our latest book that we published. I know that we delivered some of this to some of you in person when we published it in Pittsburgh. We had like a bike delivery service, and we were biking all through Pittsburgh to bring these publications, which was fun. And also my legs got really like, really ready because it's really hilly. So this narrative architecture book that is also asking questions about critiques of ideology through representation, and series of murals and collages we've done to try to understand the legacy of form and utopian thinking through cities, right? First smaller murals, and then later on with larger ones in museums. This one's in the museum in Nuremberg, Germany. And our book on pure hardcore icons, trying to understand, you know, the legacy of pure form in relationship to power, relationship to ideology. We made the book we published it in English in UK in 2013. And this year finally got published in Chinese. We redesigned it. We added some extra interviews and published it again in Chinese with the China Architecture and Building Press. Did a series of exhibitions. This is an exhibition 2014, got translated into German. Berlin. We've been working through like form making and also books of poetry. Want to go ahead? Yeah.
We're going to ask you to wrap up just so we can get some questions in.
Then we're done.
Sorry, it was supposed to be like a 5 minutes introduction and like a reflection.
If you don't tell me.
It was so good, but we want people to ask questions also. You have to be a prepared question if people don't have questions, but like it's open to everyone.
We should start with a few questions that we have written, and then we can see where the discussion leads, I think, right?
Yeah, you want to open it up?
Sure. I mean, you think we should just start from the top?
Yeah, so so our first issue was on climate change, and now we're focused on world building. And world building is like, you know, we feel like your work relates in a way because there's like this connection between the past, present, and future. And narrative architecture, like the studios you run, you're not imagining a new building, but you're imagining new futures. So we wanted to ask your thoughts on the world building process. How do you feel about it? And how does your work connect the past, present, and future? You know, like your narrative architecture book. So that especially where there's that epilogue that talks about the future in a way, but then you're also critiquing the past and present.
I mean, today we were literally teaching in theory class. We were talking about Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, that is a Bolivian activist, theorist, philosopher, thinker. And she was talking about how for the Aymaran, the Aymara indigenous philosophy, understanding of history is not a linear history. It's a history that is in spiral, and in a spiral where the past future is packed in the present, right? So things are always connected. That's why since really early when we started our practice, even, when we have done nothing basically other than complain, there was always this presence of the parallel with time, like 68, we started our practice in 2008, 40 years from the civil rights, 40 years from Stonewall, 40 years from indigenous people taking over Alcatraz, right? So there's a real presence of the past in the present and in the conception of the future, where history is not just something that you discard and you kind of erase and write over, but it's always developing and always kind of impregnated with what's happening. And for us, when we think about world making, right, and we think about pluriversality, right, like the idea that the other worlds are possible, that a Eurocentric understanding of history is really incomplete, right, and violent and criminal. When we have all these things in perspective, we can start to think about other worlds are possible and real and necessary. Therefore, we have to make them, right? Like we have to find the tools that are gonna allow us to imagine those futures, right? And those worlds. And for us, that's the part of it, right? Like it's always, and we bring also Wittgenstein, like the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Like we need tools to be able to construct, to communicate those worlds, but also we need all the narratives that are missing. We need the people to tell us those narratives. Yeah. How about you, dear?
No, I was just going to quote Silvia Rivera Cusiconchi, but you did already, because we were speaking about her this morning. But it's a very interesting question, because again, I feel like this concept of time has been so present, again, as Cruz mentioned, like in our work from early on, because the importance of looking at history in many different ways, if it was like looking at precedents that are more known, and questioning also how this knowledge was constructed, but also trying to look for more like less known or more underground storytelling of what happened in the past is really important for us to be able to understand the present. But therefore, because we can understand the present, we can try to articulate the future. And in a way, like the question of futurity also is again like is both like looking at the past to be able to understand the present, but to be able also to open to the possibilities of futures or other futures, and maybe more critical futures, but also how to understand that this kind of reappropriation of a tool and knowledges of its construction that time is necessary to do that too. And also I feel what is even more urgent is to understand the gap and the voids that are existing in this construction of history, a construction of time, because the voids are never accidents somehow. Is to understand also that how history is subjective, how history is constructed, depending on who's telling the stories, right? Or who has access to this knowledge and to the propagation of this knowledge too. So it's again like questioning all this and how this is, archive of knowledge was constructed and things like this. And I think it's really empowering to try to address that in order to, again, to be more liberated when we want to address the question of futurity, which is like a very, again, like pressing issue, and that we all need to kind of, get our hands on that in order to, rethink other worlds, better worlds, more critical worlds.
Good answer. One thing we were interested in for this issue was using the idea of world building, imagining new world, writing new stories to try and sort of examine the present. Do you think we have to do that sort of exercise, imagine other things in order to liberate ourselves from ideas in the present that maybe we take for granted?
Yeah, I think we are in a crisis of imagination. I think on one hand, it's not only us imagining, but also bringing people to imagine, right? Like, because if only have the same people, there's a limit to how far the imagination stretches. In a way, it's like it's like there's so much I can imagine, right? Because so much references I have in my life. But if we have the right people and they open up and so on, the other question is, if there's a crisis in the sense that when people say, oh, let's abolish the police, for example, and they say like, oh, but how is that possible? Like, who's gonna keep me safe, right? Like, it's such a lack of imagination. It's like, if you only can imagine being safe because there's a guy walking with an AK-14 around you, AK-47 around you, you have a fucked up sense of safety, right? It's just like you have no creativity. If you only think that the only way to be safe is to make the New York police the 7th largest military in the world, you have no imagination, right? If you think that the only way to keep you safe is to build a wall instead of investing in like education or like things for the future of people, you have no imagination. We have trained a generations of like engineers and policymakers that they are literally intellectually constipated. They have no imagination. They have no creativity. These people are literally just a concrete block in the head. They cannot imagine ways of living. They cannot even see it because people already know. People actually live other ways of lives, but they have no idea. Like they are completely obsolete. I mean, the fact that we go to architecture school and somebody's still talking about Palladio, it shows that we have no imagination, right? Like there are billions of people. There are billions of people in the world. There are billions of ways of living, and we're still talking about Palladio or Colin Rowe and whatever nonsense they want to sell you in architecture school or in school in general, right? Like we're really in a crisis of creativity and imagination. And it's not about making IDO and making robots that are gonna work for the police. That's what happens when we have no imagination, right? When everything we develop can be militarized and can be turned against us, because we're only producing value for a capitalist machine that wants to turn everything into military occupation, right? So to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? That's not creativity, right? That's not being critical. That's basically supplying to a neoliberal machine, right? Of where everything is already a formula, right? Like whatever you're gonna produce is gonna be appropriated by sort of the empire, right? So how can we get out of that, right? How can we live in any other ways? And there's many other ways of living, as the world can attest, right? But we are really obsessed with some real fixed, and as Silvia Rivera Cosicanqui will also say, quite primitive ways of living, right? Like capture, predation, the spoliation of the earth, that's really primitive. People would think that that's modern, but it's not. That's the most primitive way to live, basically to destroy the earth, right? We have no sensibility whatsoever. So yes, we really need to exercise that creativity, if we want to call it that way, but we also need to have the appropriate people, right? Like we need to have a massive, I don't want to use cleansing because it sounds ugly. We want to have we have to wash like the ranks of many places, right? Because they're kind of full of those mentally constipated people, right? They cannot see futures. They can't. They're unable, right? Like their brains have been damaged by a system of education, right? A system of economy that doesn't allow them to see beyond.
But I don't know if it's damage or it's on the contrary, it's like very control or very kind of I don't know if like monodirectional or like, trying. I think it's the same when we speak about conception of time. It's like this kind of conception of imaginary and imagination. And again, like futurity is like always has been kind of controlled. It's interesting because also this morning we were speaking a lot about the idea of modernity. And I think it goes hand in hand with that. It's like a kind of a project of a modernity, of the idea of progress, of the idea of future is always so defined when, again, it's controlled by this kind of system of knowledges. But I don't think that the fact that it doesn't exist, I think on the contrary, all these kind of parallel imaginaries or parallel narrative or other world, I think also the concept of world making is very important for that. And it has been always present, again, like since a lot of time, but the problem is like they haven't been so visible. So the question also is like how to allow other people to tell their own story in order, again, to question this construction of narrative and this idea of imaginaries. Because I do believe that, other imaginaries, other worlds are happening right now. The problem is like if they are not made visible, or the people who think about that, who had this present in their culture for so long, again, are not in the main stage.
Hi, Susan, Natalie. I actually had a quick comment on that. I was just wondering what you guys thought then about the ethical stance behind, you know, we talk about reimagining the way the world is, but it's like the world was already almost imagined in a way before, I guess, beings with a lot of conscience started to like alter it. So it's like, to what extent can we actually reimagine, and or is it more a matter of reimagining the parts that are more problematic, like through like systemic racism and oppression, and what parts of it is it actually like redoing that racist imagination that existed and like getting back to just the origins, I guess.
Yeah,
a different primitive world.
This is a great question, because it's the question of like when people say you should always try to be, how you say, you know, everybody should fulfill their dreams, everybody should always, that sort of entrepreneurial dreams. And I think like, no, like if your dream is some white supremacist eugenic state, no, don't follow your dreams, please. Just do everything except that. So in what way can we think of radically inclusive, radically emancipatory imaginaries, right? I don't think it's like all imaginaries are welcome. It's more like, how can we truly achieve truly emancipatory spaces, right? And who's gonna allow us to do that? And how can we do that together, right? And you know, not even in an utopian world, everybody will agree in what that means, right? But we can agree that there's some really problematic parts of society, right, that are not sustainable, right? So how can we address those? How can we enhance and allow for the critical spaces, the spaces that are emancipatory to flourish and to subvert other forms of oppression, right?
Yeah, I think also when we think, because again, like going back to the concept of world making, I think what's interesting is like, also historically, all this comes from practices of mutual knowledge, like mutual sharing of knowledge, mutual construction of knowledge too, which also implies that you're not alone. And I think maybe the key on finding also more critical, you know, as you were saying, like question of new imaginaries or like other imaginaries, and also addressing the importance of intersectionality, because again, I think it's through the intersectional lens that we try to be, you know, as inclusive or as universal in a good way as possible, that is possible. So again, like, I think the idea of collective knowledge and collective critical thinking is really important, because also it's acknowledging the limitation of everyone in that regard too. So I think if we all start to question also our limitations and start to again expand in how we can collaborate with others, learn from others, listen to others, not always think that, you know, always like the same people would have the same answers and things like this. I think also that could help a lot to address again like better imagination of what could come after, or what could replace what is actually now. And again, I think like looking at history is always important too, because again, I think like all those questions have been historically very present since many years. So a lot of people already had like really interesting answers or like theories about it and things like this, that because of context, sometimes those theories were just, you know, didn't have a chance to go through, or also because, you know, of historical also situation that on purpose they were like restrained to be developed and things like this. But again, I think like it's again like this movement between the past and the future, and also like this kind of expanding of our tools by expanding the team, somehow being like able to be really like a collective and trying to think together in a more critical way.
I could jump in. Yeah, so I guess one thing I've been thinking about is, so we each live in our own worlds in some sense. So we each see the world differently, and then in some sense that's, you know, infinite amount of different worlds. And the interesting thing about narratives and narrative architecture is the ability to create empathy among one another. So, you know, there's like this divisiveness that you talk about, you know, this colonial, I guess, footprint, you know, in universities across the country and et cetera. And I guess I was wondering, in what way do you see world building a bridge between that? You know, because for a kid who never learned critical race theory, you know, it's not because they're a bad person, it's just they never got introduced to it. So how could world building create the empathy and help people see different perspectives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had to start by saying there are some people that are actually bad people. Because the problem is that sometimes we start with the premise, and then I also will say this too. Some architects are just literally white supremacists and sexists, right? So it's not that they do stuff because they didn't know.
I don't know.
They actually are fucking disgusting, and they use architecture as an excuse. Like, I met many, and probably you'll meet many, and maybe you have met many already, right? So I don't want to excuse them and cut them some slack, because like we know injustice when we see it many times, and sometimes out of lack of power we don't do anything, but sometimes like we're contributing to it, and we need to be like, first of all, be able to call that out. I feel like that's the first step, to be able to really say like, it's not that we are powerless, it's that we are actually contributing to it, right? And then on the other hand, I feel like the question about empathy, it's a question of education, right? It's a question of like caring for each other, but also it's a question of dismantling systems of exclusion, right? It's gonna be really difficult to have spaces where collective and mutual narratives can be generated when the people are not there. Right? We were giving credit to a project here in Iowa State, and there were some students, you know, making a project about Syria, about refugees, and I was like, is anybody here from Syria, or you have any contact with Syria? I said, no. But how can you imagine the narrative of somebody that is not even here, and you haven't even talked to them, right? Like, are you gonna rely on a TV show to tell you, you know, who they are or how they feel, right? So I feel like if the institutions or we as a collective don't have the voices there, it's going to be really difficult to imagine those spaces. And I think like maybe it's not even about empathy. It's not empathy what we need. I think like empathy is overstated. I think that what we need to be is like less invasive, less assholes, less white supremacists, less misogynists, less transphobic, less transphobic, right? Like all these things are, I think it's more straightforward, the character. But then on one hand, people say like, yeah, we want to be anti-racist, blah, blah. So here's your syllabus, Palladio, Peter Eisenman, and two other dudes. Like, come on. Like, how are we gonna learn anything else if you're doing the minimum effort to change it? And maybe they're not being provided any infrastructure and preparation for it, right? So then we have to go back, like hiring policies, recruitment policies, in a studio, you know, where are you practicing? You know, even studios that may look like they're doing a good job and they're really problematic, like what's the name? Mass Design Group. When you hear the founder talking about like, I was in Harvard hearing about this guy, how he's basically gonna save the third world, and then you're there like, really? Is this what we're doing? Right? Like we should be getting out of there and like stop like occupying and expanding, you know, the sort of imperial footprint of the US and of American institutions, right? So I feel like as long as we're not willing to risk stuff, we are not gonna change anything. I think like real change is gonna happen when we are willing to say, you know, I'm gonna lose a bunch of projects and I'm going to lose wealth and I'm going to, but then this needs to be done, right? And it's not because I feel for you, but rather because this is unfair, right? And it's not just, and then we need to stop it.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, especially when you bring again like a question of empathy, because it would be great if we could have like a formula that, you know, once you apply it, everybody is empathic, but unfortunately it doesn't really work like this. So again, I feel like, yeah, like to go just to reinforce a little bit what Cruz was saying. I feel like, again, like if we make all these discourses or all these knowledges more visible and being, so again, when you think, you know, by default, what is always there present in our education or our institution, or again, in the idea of a construction of, again, like knowledge and understanding of society and things like this, how can we make as dominant the other ones, right? The ones that, again, are left out, or the ones that we need to push forward to. So until they are not as present and as, you know, part of every, again, like studio, discussion, institution, classes, and things like this, then it's really difficult, again, like to question the question of access, because if it relies on your, so of course we know that, you know, some people know that for all their life, and some people, you know, have better understandings of the situation. But the problem is, like, if somebody, again, is in a very different context, how, again, like even if somebody is also confronted to some extent to this kind of new discourses, it's like you have to make it really part, because it should be part of a, so I don't like the term normal, so I don't think normal is a good term, but it should be as present, let's say, as all the other discourses, because that's where it should belong. But yeah, it's really tricky, because to do that, it has to enter, and again, like that goes back to the question of the importance of institution and a critical point of view on that too, because the power that they have, again, and is educational institution, is institution of knowledges, institution of archives, institution of cultures, so museums and all and so on, right? Even publication, books and all this, we can do like a long list, but again, are so powerful in just relaying the same kind sometime of discourse, so specifically in some places, right, where, you know, the other part is really left out, again, on purpose. So I feel there's so much work to be done in the institutions because of that, because of the power that they have. Otherwise, I would say, yeah, so just to have like something more optimistic, and there are still other ways to try to do projects where you could, it's not bridge the gap, but kind of try to address this, or like think of different tools too that can make people more aware of that. But again, the problem is, like, because of the importance and the impact of institution, it's really a huge task at hand. But of course, we still need to try to address that as much as we can in parallel too. It's a difficult question.
Cruz? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, so you just mentioned about a mass a little earlier. Yeah. Mass about the founder trying to go to the third world and convince them that you're helping them. Mass design group, hello?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I cannot hear. Maybe it's too loud, my mic. You repeat again?
oh, he's talking about mass design group.
Oh,
Yeah, mass, yeah.
So you said how the founder is trying to convince everyone that he's going to the third world as a savior almost. But I find something very interesting. For example, they built this hospital in Rwanda. And then after they built the hospital in Rwanda, a lot of locals over there, they told mass design groups that, okay, come design my house as well. I want my house to look like that hospital. So how to convince the locals that it's, you know, probably not a good thing, that you just to, you know, follow, you know, trends that are superimposed on you.
Yeah, I mean, that's the history of settler colonialism, right? You go to a place, you show what is modern and progress, and then everybody wants that, right? Even if it doesn't make sense economically, culturally. But I mean, that's how colonialism works, right? Like that's how modern ideas about modernization and modernism have been so problematic all around the world, right? We all have, I mean, today, we literally spend an hour in the morning discussing why do we call positive things progressive, right? Why to be why backwards is negative, right? We always assume that there's a vectorial element to quality, right? That if it's looking towards the future, right? Images of the future in the sense of modernity, modern are positive things, right? That's really embedded in our language, really embedded in our way of understanding the world. And these people understand it well. If you look at the page of the description of the founding of the company, the guy, the founder of MAS, is saying, I was sitting in a room in Harvard, hearing this guy talking about the nonprofit, the NGO that is gonna go and offer this thing outside. And I feel like, wow, I can do that. I mean, it sounds like savior complex, right? And it is, you know, like the fact that it's in Harvard, in a hall in Harvard, thinking about Africa, right, is so problematic if you understand the history of these institutions in regimes of imperialism, right, of modernism as a violent act of occupation, right? So I think like the example you're bringing is exactly the thing. Not only that, but they have been basically buying the competition, right? To give you an example, like I have friends that have practices where they're trying to work with collectives of mutual aid, of like working with actual communities, and he tried to buy them, like, oh, you should be one of our partners. They're like, no, I don't want to work for a corporation like this, right? Like it is really like American capitalism, right? Like we know about the Clinton Foundation in Haiti, right? Basically taking millions and at the end doing nothing. Basically a bunch of people spreading cholera to the Haitians, you know, in the middle of their own crisis, right? So coming from a place, especially us, you know, being in the headquarters of empire, right? In the universities, right, that are particularly problematic in the construction of those premises about knowledge, about progress, about modernity. How can we be critical agents, right? And not only participating as passive, you know, people perpetuating systems of power that is always asymmetrical. Like if you think about the wealth and power of these institutions compared to the places where they interact with communities, other countries, and so on, it's always a really asymmetrical relationship, right? Universities are kind of undefeated. They have endowments that are exponentially growing. Same with these companies, right? Like they somehow attach to them and they kind of replicate these systems of globalization in a way, in the capitalist sense of the word, right? Like that they keep on expanding these systems of oppression. That is, I think, like it's the opposite of world making. It's making in the world, but not world making, right? It's a very centralized neoliberal model of making in the world.
I got the question I had. I mean, hopefully, if you got that question, just please jump in. Yeah, you know, it's a lot to process, but I mean, it's for you guys more than anything. But we'll keep on asking questions. A crucial thing to think about when world building is, what world building are you destroying another world? You know, and that's a big legacy of colonialism. So, Le Corbusier version of world building is tearing down cities around the world, you know, putting something else. So when thinking about world building, how do we not tear down worlds, but just add another layer, you know? Because the idea that there's many worlds, but especially as architects, how do we do that? Since so much of our training is building, you know, creating like physical manifestations, how do we build worlds without destroying other worlds?
Yeah, that's a great question. But to be honest with you, I'm into destroying a bunch of worlds right now. I'm into the demolishing business. I am like a wrecking ball, I feel. Because let's say in a ground zero, like it never existed, right? But let's say that we are all even, and it's almost like the theory of the free market, right? Like we are free to compete against each other, but we know that that's not the truth, right? We know that there's many systems in place that won't allow for those worlds to flourish. And I'm really interested in taking them down, however possible. And that's pretty much my premise. I know that, yes, there's some things that we need to protect and some things that we need to help flourish and so on. But to be honest with you, like in my role, like in our role, perhaps, I'm more interested in engaging against power. I believe that yes, voices should be amplified, but I am not a microphone, to be honest with you. And I feel like my job will be to get out of the way and let people express their points. Like I don't want to be an interlocutor. I feel like the idea of the translator is an outdated idea. I'm not needed for that. I feel like that's not our role. And that's what I feel like many architects fail, because they want to translate the wishes of a community. And no, the community should be able to carry their wishes if you allow them, right? Probably architects will come out of there and designers will come out of there. I feel like that's a truly emancipatory system. Communities won't need people to drop there in parachute and do stuff for them, right? I feel like they will be empowered to do it. And then on the other hand, what is stopping that from happening? That's what I'm really interested in addressing. I'm more interested in exposing white supremacy and misogyny and heteropatriarchy than to be a translator of Black imagination or indigenous imagination, right? I feel like those things should be there, happening continuously, right? Free to be different or opaque or be something that we don't know what it is, right? Like I'm talking about those specific ones, but many different ways of existing in the world that we don't even know what they are, right? I have no idea what they are, you know, like queer ecology, whatever it is, right? I have no idea. And that's what it should be. It should be completely free, but it's not. And why it's not, right? Like what is stopping those that we're making from happening, right? That's our interest. That's what we go after institutions. That's what we address the universities or the police or the military or redlining or whatever the institutions are doing, right? So it's almost like instead of going, I'm not going horizontally. I'm literally aiming up and try to chop some heads. You know, it's like the status question, right? Just chop the head of the statue and demolish it. And then after whatever happens, I have no idea what it's gonna be. Like, but let new worlds grow out of the ashes of those systems of oppression. That's what I am right now. And perhaps that's I feel like that has always been our practice. Our narratives are not so much coming from, we're not the translator of the oppressed. Like we always aiming like form, you know, like who controls form, power, right? Like who controls ideology, power, right? Like that's our aim. The statue, right? Like the monument, the institution. That's why also we work with universities in a way too. What do you think, Leo?
Oh, that's a good answer. I was again, because the distraction, also the idea of distraction is interesting, because again I was thinking of a text of Ariela Aisha Azoulay called in her book Potential History, and she speaks a lot about that, how the idea of distraction goes hand in hand with the idea of progress and the idea of newness that we were speaking about previously, and how also this idea of demolition, deconstruction is not just about building like physical entities, but also about, you know, system of knowledge, systems of values, systems of cultures, and all this, and how it's important also to fight against that. But again, like I think like Cruz's answer is really good in the way that maybe it's not about preserving everything, right? There's like also some new construction, not just again in terms of architecture, but again in terms of system of knowledges, systems of values, systems of cultures that maybe should be also taken out too. So I think like it's kind of a tricky question, because again it's like, you know, do we need to keep everything? And again, not just in the physical way, right? In how we build our worlds, and who has the say on what to keep or what not to keep, right? Who has the say to understand what has value and what not, what doesn't have value? And I think it goes exactly in what Cruz was pointing out, is like, to some extent, we should just be removed, and then it's not our question to be able to answer that. Sorry, it's not our role, sorry, to be able to answer that question, right? I think the people who are really in, like, who are part of it, who are really touched daily by it, they should be the one to answer the question of what has to be, again, like in the idea. I think it goes also to like a larger discussion of the terms of preservation and terms of, archive and all this, like all those terms are really interesting because they really collide in a way that they explain the construction of our present, again, like system of value, system of understanding of knowledges and things like this. So how can we sometimes just be removed of a question and let the right people answer that question?
It's almost like, how much time are you going to spend trying to patch up a tree whose roots are rotten and like could poison the rest of the plants nearby, right? It's like the purpose of like removal, and then dealing with whatever might grow there again in the future. But like the first step is removing it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, take it out of the root.
And what if it's like, it's again, like it's invasive species or something that, you think that always has been there, but actually shouldn't even be there in the first place.
And I met many artists, for example, and I'm saying artists in a really broad sense of the word, designers, music makers, whatever. And they're really interested in creating like voices, right? Like voices of like Black imagination, or indigenous imagination, queer imagination, and so on. And in a way, I really appreciate that, but that's not really that has never been our work necessarily. Even if we are proposing a post-colonial imagination, the post-colonial one is more about exposing power than those imaginations. I feel like in that sense, we are a bit like what avant-garde it means in military sense. Like avant-garde is the front line in the war, and then you go and then you die, and then the people that come behind can do something else. I feel like that a bit, like just going in the front line and you're like pissing people off, and people may try to make you lose your job, and you make them lose their job, and it's like a continuous fight for taking those positions out of the institutions, or like demolishing the institutions if it's possible. And I feel like our work is somewhere there at this moment. I don't know where it's gonna be in 20 years, but I feel like in the last 13 years, since we found it has always been interested with those questions, right? So in a way, we're a bit more difficult to box when you're trying to define what we're trying to say, because it's not necessarily like we are trying to find our voice, but we are sometimes a mirror or like a hammer or a shovel or dynamite.
Chris, that brings something up that I was talking to Sam, who isn't here, but one question he was thinking about, writing about, the issue was, how do you think that the inherent biases built into our tools used by the design profession actually shape the world? Talking about hammers earlier, to hammer now. We use certain tools, certain ways of researching, certain ways of making drawings and objects that we do. If we change our tools, how much do the world change?
Yeah, I think that's a Wittgenstein thing again, right? Like the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, right? So I feel like you're only able to communicate what your language allows you to communicate, right? So that's why it's really important. Architecture is not a bubble. It's not in a bubble. And it has never been, right? Like architecture doesn't exist as just buildings, right? That they happen because of economy, because of politics, because of culture, because of society, because of philosophy. So since all of these things are so embedded with architecture, we should always take them into consideration, right? Like they should always be part of what we are thinking about. And that way we won't run out of tools, right? And I feel like the more we bring people in the conversation, the more we are opening up, the more tools that we don't know they exist will come into play, right? Like we are so unable to read many other forms of language because we are trained in such orthodox ways, right? Like a drawing, I mean, radical is to make animations like a drawing, a model, like how we can communicate, right? But what are the many forms of communication that exist, right? Material and emotional and interpersonal, right? And historical. And how can we use those to construct those critiques and positions and imaginaries? And I feel like that's really fundamental. Like we had to open up, like there's people that needs to be present. There are many different ways of thinking and making, and perhaps that will expand our set of tools, right? When we're thinking about language.
I think that's like, I just want to add something really short about this, but I think it's also like a really fundamental question. It's not just about, what tools are we using, but again, like the question of like how also to address certain issues, but also include other people in a conversation too. So I feel, especially when we think about architecture, a lot of those tools are very difficult in terms of communication. And I think they have been, again, like they have been so because it has been something that was, meant to be more I say like control in a certain way, but it was like this idea of, you had to be expert, for example, to understand the plan or something like this. And why do we have, again, when we speak about our built environment too, I think also the most common tools are quite limited, again, in the way that they are not meant to communicate with everybody that lives in this built environment. So I think also it's like a really fundamental question is asking, how can we expand these tools? How also can we know what tools to use when we want to communicate with other people, like many different publics. Like, again, I'm thinking a lot of projects that we did with children that were like, we learned so much out of working with children too. But of course, it's not just about, drawing plans and things like this. It was like, we were writing stories, we were making playgrounds and things like this. But again, like the creation of the knowledge that came out of this was for us, like, as valid as other types of conversation with other types of tools and things like this.
Have you read the Undercommons by Fred Moten? Have any of you read the Undercommons? We were reading it yesterday. I'm gonna read you a line because I think it really applies to this. The subversive intellectual, we learn, is unprofessional, uncollegial, passionate, and disloyal. The subversive intellectual is neither trying to extend the university nor change the university. You can replace the university for architecture. The subversive intellectual is not toiling in misery and from this place of misery articulating a general antagonism. In fact, the subversive intellectual enjoys the ride and wants it to be faster and wilder. She does not want a room for his or her own. She wants to be in the world with others and making the world anew. Like, there's a really interesting kind of Moten is saying like the enemy of criticality is professionalization, right? Against the prophetic organization of the Undercommons. The Undercommons is that sort of commons that is hidden in the shade, in the shadows, because they have been pushed away from the center by the institutions. He says the negligence against the prophetic organization of the Undercommons is its own deadening labor for the university, and beyond that, the negligence of professionalization and then professionalization of the critical academic. The Undercommons is therefore always an unsafe neighborhood, right? He's aiming to be in the Undercommons. Professionalization is an enemy of that. Professionalization doesn't allow you to be critical, because in order to be professional, you had to fulfill the criteria of neoliberalism, right? Like, you have to be able to communicate in the language they want you to communicate. You have to talk about the things they find important. Otherwise, you're not being professional. You're not being disciplinary enough, right? And that's something that we have to fight against, right? That needs to change. And that really relates to ideas about language and representation and the tools we have, right? If you're using a language that is outside of what the profession can understand, you will be deemed kind of unnecessary or problematic and so on, right? Because you're not talking the language. And I feel like that's where maybe some form of criticality, a form of subversion lies. And that's what also Fred Moten is referring to. And many other scholars, right? Like there's a form of questioning what is valuable knowledge, right? And how do you communicate that? And what are other knowledges that have been left out because they're not considered valuable, right? Again, if we talk about Palladio, why is Palladio valuable? It's not. I mean, I can make an argument that it's not, right? Or if it's valuable, why is it the only valuable thing, right? Versus billions of other things that we could be learning about and communicating about. I don't know if it's addressing the question directly.
No, it sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone else wants to ask a question, I mean, we're hoping, you know, it's for you guys. It's just to see me and Robert ask a question. So, I don't know.
Abby's so silent, Abby.
I'm busy. Like, to support you.
Or do you guys have any questions? Do you have any questions? Well, you can ask anything. They are very.
But Abby has so many questions when I'm teaching a class, but doesn't have them now. I don't understand.
Because I'm being diverse. I'm betraying you as the authority. You're not the authority over me anymore, so it's not interesting anymore.
Oh wait, Selena has a question.
I noticed that.
I can barely hear you. Maybe it's
Yeah,
too
we
far
can.
from the microphone.
Like, I noticed that it's like class for students in China, and I wonder what you think of like Chinese architecture education.
What is our take on Chinese architecture education?
Yeah.
Wow. Wait, how do I say this?
It's okay. You don't have to worry about too much.
It's a really tricky question because we have to talk about Chinese education in general to talk about Chinese architecture education, right? And there's some things to be said about Chinese institutions copying the worst of American institutions. I feel sometimes in the way of hierarchies and in the way of I feel like sometimes Chinese architecture education is split between being anti-international discourses or being too embedded in neoliberal global systems of capitalism. And almost you can see it by school. Like if you go like Tongji in Shanghai is a very like embedded in sort of global systems of neoliberal capital. And then you have other schools like Tsinghua that are really good, but that are more kind of political in a way, like centralized power. I feel like the role of the educator in China is a bit kind of fixed. It's not very flexible. And I'm telling you because I have friends, Chinese architects, that sometimes they have problems teaching within the Chinese institutions where they study. Actually, they studied there, then went abroad, they came back, and they felt like it's a very rigid institution, maybe because of the relationship to centralized politics, especially in Beijing, for example, right? Like there's such a close relationship to centralized politics. And in a way, I feel like, for example, for us, it will be almost impossible to have many of the discourses we have in other countries, to have them there. I feel like maybe that wouldn't be necessarily a space to do it. But on the other hand, I feel like there's a lot of potential for forms of critique that are not Eurocentric in a way. So I think that's an interesting proposition in the way that people can generate knowledge that is not based on sort of Eurocentric forms of knowledge. But I don't know. I feel like we're in a really weird moment where, because of the economic situation in China for 20, 30 years has been so frenetic, that the schools have been also supplying professionals to supply that chain, right, of production. So I don't know how much critical forms of knowledge that are critical of the system can be generated or have been generated in the last 20 years, right? So I don't know if it's a space that is allowing for that to happen. I know that it's generating great designers, but I don't know if in the sense of critical thinking and questioning the power, I don't even know if it's possible, to be honest with you. And that's something that maybe is interesting, but also maybe worrying in a way. Like, I don't know if institutions in China are participating on some of the questions that we are all having about, you know, the spoliation of the earth, or questions about sort of ethnic conflict, right? I have no idea if those questions are taking place or if they're allowed to take place, which that would be an interesting premise, right? And I feel like it's really important. I feel like sometimes I feel like I can say things that will get me in trouble, but I still can say them, and I'm kind of protected for saying them. I mean, in Iowa, not so much. I have to be more careful. but there, I feel like many questions are not necessarily being addressed, even if there's people that could be addressing them as teachers. So
I think also, like, we know, I think it's been a while too since we've been more in touch with the institutions in China too, because it was, of course, like easier when we were living there. But also I feel that there will be a change, and probably the change is already happening, because I remember also in terms of generation of who was teaching there versus who's teaching now, because when we were there also, it was like in the middle of having still the, let's say, like the older masters, like the older partners of offices that have been there since a while, that were running the main studios. But now I feel like there's a lot of like new practitioners that are really interesting designers that now are also teaching in the universities. But I feel that happened like really recently, maybe in the last, you know, five to 8 years too. So I think it's, yeah, I would be really curious also to see what is happening there. But in terms of design, yeah, I think there's also like well, in terms of discourse, I would be really curious to see what's happening there, and I feel it's more difficult to see if you don't have access to that. But in terms of design, I can see also a lot of change happening, just because also of this like new generation coming into academia too.
I will see you all Monday. What did I park? I parked over here this time. Good.
Can I ask a dumb question?
We love dumb questions.
Okay, kind of relates to Polo, but it's like, so we acknowledge that he's bad, but I'd like to argue that Patrick Schumacher is worse. How do we deal with the Patrick Schumachers of the world?
that Schumacher is what?
How do we deal with the Patrick Schumachers of the world? That's a question.
Patrick, you
Have you read his Facebook right?
No, I don't want you to tell you. I think I hold a little bit of power over every time I go, who is that? To someone I really should know, but I don't care about and isn't important to what I want to do. And I don't understand why we say there's no, like, I feel like the first time I went, who's Corbusier? I wish I could still do that. And I think
don't.
No, I consider.
It's also funny as hell. Actually do that. Yeah.
No, I consider do it. It's still because I think
That's a form of.
because why should I have to know about them? I should.
Not radical.
No, but there, okay, so there's a difference between Le Corbusier and Schumacher. So Le Corbusier may have been an asshole. He built some works that we can learn from them, even if we don't like the guy. I feel like we still should learn from Le Corbusier. Like he was quite a good designer if you build some of the buildings, right? And he was also involved in colonialism. So even if we're against colonialism, we have to understand his role. Like Le Corbusier was proposing cities in Algiers, right? Like if we are for emancipation, we had to understand who are the protagonists of the empire, right? Le Corbusier was a protagonist, right? We will understand, you know, Brazil much better if we understand Le Corbusier, like Brasilia and so on. Patrick Schumacher, on the other hand, is just terrible. And it's So I don't know, like I will wish that he doesn't exist, but he exists and he writes a lot of nonsense. So yeah, I just wish he goes away and people stop giving him platform.
I think we're gonna wrap it up here before getting kind of sleepy, kind of tired. We love you a lot. We miss you. We wish that you were still at CMU. I mean, thank you for taking the time. We know that you're super busy. We do not take this time for granted.
Yeah.
It was so nice to see everyone.
Yeah.
I wish
nice
it
to
would be
see.
in person, but yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I gotta come to Pittsburgh sometime.
I know we have to come back.
Yeah, so we're gonna, our plan is our second issue is world building, and we're hoping to release that mid-November. Each of these issues is like a work in progress, but the most important thing is getting people to get their voices out there, which isn't a comfortable thing. We talked with Lydia a little bit, we're hoping to do it too with Milmos, a collaboration, exactly interested in that. And yeah, I mean, we love you. Thank you for taking the time.
Nice hoodie, Abby.
You can see it. You can see it from here. I guess.
You just remember it from first year?
Ah,
Yes,
nice.
I got it in an artist gallery.
That's cool.
Nice to see everybody. Nice to meet
Yes,
some of you.
Super nice to meet and to talk with everyone. Yeah.
And anything, we're
That's
always
great.
available.
Yeah. You can come to Ames. We here.
With like Becca and Brian about I miss being included in Natalie's studio. That was fun. I was proud of my work back then. and then going and being like, why was I able to produce such good stuff?
That's very cool. If you could give a 30-second answer for this, so super short, but as students and as a lot of us are fifth years leaving architecture school, in 30 seconds, how do we make a positive difference, and is it possible within systems like firms, etc., or do we have to operate outside?
Being nice and welcoming to each other, and find things that are missing in the school and try to bring them in. I feel like that's the most important thing. Like, make the school not only what is contained inside the walls of the campus, but always look out and try to expand that and make it a really permeable and inclusive space. I feel like that would be the biggest difference.
And the simple when you'll be out, right? Whatever you do after, because you have also all this awareness. So whatever you do, first is find things that makes you comfortable with, in a way, to some extent, that you don't have to compromise too much, and just doing that, and you just follow your intuition in terms of what you think you want to be involved with, what you want to do, if it's also inside institution, outside institutions, and everything will make a difference, to be more optimistic.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We love you.
Thank you. So nice to see you. So nice to see you.
Nice
Thanks
to see
again.
you.
Thank you for taking the
Stay
time.
safe. And
Yeah,
always remember, confusion is key.
Okay, we'll send the issue when we're done with it.
Yeah.
And as always, we'll stay in touch.
Yes.
Thank you. Have a good night.
So nice
Good
to
night.
see you. Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Nice to see you. Good night.
Bye.
Thanks for hosting this.